Professor Jeff Engel, the former director of the Scowcroft Institute, one of my predecessors and my role model for how to act in this office. He is now director of the Presidential Study Center. Is that what it's called?
Center for
Presidential History at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And he is doing a magisterial work on the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a huge work that he is now almost finished. And Professor Castillo is going to interrogate him about his presentation. So Jason Castillo and Jeff Engel.
I thought what we would do is Jeff would give some opening remarks, and we've been tasked to start to uncover some of the awards, I think, here.
Well, we were tasked with that, but I don't recall agreeing to that.
Oh, okay.
So,
well, I'll try to keep you on task. This is an honor for me because I've always been a big Scowcroft fan since the days of the Scowcroft Commission and the vulnerability of our bomber bases. But people used to not care about those issues, but they're back, baby, so that's very exciting. And the other honor I have here is that Jeff and I used to teach the methods course, the qualitative methods course back in, I think it was 2009 that we used to teach that?
I hadn't thought about that year,
Yeah.
but yes,
It was an election year.
I can recall it happened.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, it was a mostly positive experience. So, Brother Engel, if you want to take the floor, and then we'll have a conversation.
Sure, thank you. Let me, of course, say what a wonderful pleasure it is to be back, and thank you, Ambassador, for the wonderful introduction and also invitation down here to come and speak. It's great to be back with Scowcroft people, and also, in particular, great to be back with my good friend Jason. As I have to say, those of you who have not had the pleasure of taking a course from Professor Castillo, you need to remedy that. I have often said that he is the single best person to teach with that I've ever met, mostly because he did all the work, but also did all the speaking. So it was really very, very nice. So let me turn to someone who we are here to discuss, who is General Scowcroft. There's been so much said this morning and at lunch today about his remarkable qualities and the fact that he is really the exemplar of being the honest broker as a national security advisor and the person who we look to as the prime example of how a national security process should work, by which we generally understand that to be a security process where people's voices are heard without predetermination for what the answer is going to be, and allowed the president thereby to really think about problems in a conceptually systematic and thoughtful way, and give the president not only the time but also the even-handed information that he requires in order to make the most difficult decisions of all, in particular decisions of war and peace. And I thought I would actually try to flesh that out just a little bit with one or two vignettes to try to describe what it was, what that actually looked like, how General Scowcroft actually got the president to think about difficult issues in an even-handed and new way. And in fact, I thought I'd begin with an example from, in fact, before President Bush was president. During the time when he was vice president, thinking in particular about a momentous dinner that he and General Scowcroft happened to have together. I understand it was by coincidence, the night that President Reagan met with Mikhail Gorbachev at Reykjavik. And in fact, the night that the Reykjavik talks collapsed. Now, brief reminder of what was going on at this moment in 1986. Reagan, who had always made destroying the Soviet Union his prime objective of his presidency, and Mikhail Gorbachev, who had made preserving the Soviet Union the prime objective of his administration, came together at Reykjavik in 1986 and came closer to eliminating nuclear weapons than at any other point ever. So much so that the two of them, when the talks eventually broke down over small things such as SDI, strategic defense, so much so that the two of them actually looked at each other very windfully and sadly at the end and said, people will never really believe that we came this close. How have we come this close and not been able to resolve this issue? And the two of them left essentially depressed. That was not the view that General Scowcroft and Vice President Bush had that evening. Now, the two of them, as each of them have independently described the story in both oral histories and to me, were having dinner at the vice president's house. Now, I don't know what they served, and I don't know where they ate, but they both described watching television while having this meal. Now, according to Mrs. Bush, they had to therefore have been upstairs in the residence because there was no television downstairs in the vice president's house. So therefore, I like to picture them, again, I don't know if this is true, but I want to give you the full vignette. I like to picture them with two little stools having TV dinners. And while Vice President Bush watched, General Scowcroft turned and said, "Man, did we dodge a bullet." Dodged a bullet that the president's policies had failed. Now, interestingly enough, he said that this was actually our fault, that we had allowed Reagan, we, the collective we, the national intelligence, national security intelligentsia, if you will, because remember, General Scowcroft is not a part of the Reagan administration at this time. We had allowed Reagan, who firmly believed in abolishing nuclear weapons, for deep personal reasons. In fact, I believe the direct quote that Scowcroft used at the time was, "It's deep within him," that nuclear weapons were abhorrent, that nuclear weapons should be not a part of the international system, that nuclear weapons were by definition immoral and should be removed at all costs, that we had allowed him to put the United States in a position of essentially surrendering one of the most important strategic advantages we could possibly have, which was not only the control of nuclear weapons, but also the strategic parity that we had developed and stability from parity that we had developed with the Soviet Union at that time. And eliminating that, Scowcroft argues, was a deep mistake, and it was our fault. Why? Because the president needs to be served by people who can give him information to not only allow him to make the best decision, but to keep him from himself. That Reagan firmly believed in something which was perhaps morally right, perhaps ethically right, perhaps something that was aspirationally right, but was darn bad policy. And General Scowcroft at the time lectured at some length, this is according to both men's recollection, about the importance of not only why nuclear weapons were necessary, but why a national security bureaucracy needs to make sure that a president doesn't drive himself off the rails. Not necessarily that a national security policy shouldn't be operationalized, we've already talked about that this morning, but that a president needs to be kept within a certain reasonable box, a parameter, if you will, of acceptable policy. And in particular, when we have a president such as Reagan, not necessarily the case for H.W. Bush, but such as Reagan, who came to the presidency with almost no experience in foreign affairs. We must allow them to lead, we must allow them to generate ideas, but we need to make sure those ideas are essentially possible and practical and feasible. And that was an important part of the National Security Advisor's job, was to make sure that the president got that information and was able to make reasonable decisions. Let me give you one more vignette before we turn to the interrogation. And that has to do with the moment in August of 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Iraq. Now, this, of course, was, as we all generally understand, a surprise. Now, as surprises go, it wasn't the worst surprise in the world. People knew that the Iraqis had been blustering for some time. People knew that the Iraqis had moved forces to the Kuwaiti border for some time. The expectation was that this was simply traditional Iraqi and Middle Eastern diplomacy. They would back down. And it was somewhat of a surprise, therefore, at least when they came across the border. The initial response, we've already heard discussed this morning, and for those who were not here, I'll give you the brief recap. The initial response, especially in the first National Security Council meeting, was, shall we say, one of confusion and disarray. People did not know what to do. There was no expectation of what we would do at that point. And in fact, one of the curious facts, and I'm happy to see so many friends here from the Bush Archive here on campus, one of the curious facts that always struck me was that of all the National Security Council meetings from the Gulf War, the only one that remained classified the longest was that first meeting. And in fact, it was only released just about a year, 18 months ago, as I recall. And it always bothered me on two levels. First, because clearly this must be pretty good if it's been kept that long. But secondly, because so many people had quoted from it. Richard Haas quotes it from extensively in his memoirs. President Bush and General Scowcroft quote from it extensively in their memoirs. And parenthetically, as a historian, I think that's sort of bad baseball, shall we say. It's one thing if you want to say what happened in a meeting. I mean, I can't deny you the right to say what happened in a meeting. I wasn't there. But if you're going to quote from the minutes, you should allow the rest of us to see the minutes. Well, we finally got to see the minutes, and guess what? It's a good thing it was classified. Because the gist of the conversation from people such as, at that point, Secretary of Defense Cheney in particular, was, well, this has happened, and maybe it's not that big a deal. And maybe we shouldn't do anything. Why? Well, for two reasons. First, because it's the Kuwaitis, and nobody's particularly fond of the Kuwaitis in the first place. But secondly, and this is the more strategic argument that was at play, because Saddam Hussein had taken Kuwait in order to get its oil. Not because he wanted to keep the oil, but because he intended to sell the oil. And what is our major strategic interest in the Middle East? It's to ensure that the oil flows. Saddam Hussein has no useful purpose in getting the oil and not selling it. He has to do this. That's the whole purpose. So consequently, our strategic interest should only go so far as ensuring that he decides to keep the access of oil coming. And as long as it does, what's the big deal? Knowing how the story played out, and knowing that 4 days later, President Bush would stand on the White House lawn and say, "This will not stand," and knowing that we subsequently sent 500,000 troops into the Gulf to make sure it did not stand, and knowing that those 500,000 troops subsequently went to war and freed and liberated Kuwait, and sent the Iraqis back fleeing over the border, knowing how that all turned out, you can imagine why this first conversation would not have been good public relations had it gotten out. So how do we get then from that first chaotic meeting to the moment 4 days later when President Bush announced this will not stand? Well, as we've already heard this morning, there were subsequent NSC meetings where the argument was put forth both by General Scowcroft and by Lawrence Eagleburger in particular, who was representing the State Department at the time, with Secretary Baker being out in Mongolia, as I recall, which is actually less unusual than it sounds, given the state of Soviet-American relations and the friendship between Shevardnadze and Baker at the time. Acting Secretary, I should say, Eagleburger, was very eloquent in arguing that this was the first test of the post-Cold War system. And if we did not stand up for sovereignty at this moment, we would never again be able to stand up for sovereignty in the same way. That we do not want the stability that had been won at such cost over the course of the Cold War and was threatened at such great danger and peril with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. We did not want that instability to reign throughout the entire world. Therefore, we need to stand up for sovereignty and essentially stand up for making sure the new world order respects boundaries and respects borders. That's a very eloquent argument that was put forward, but to be honest, President Bush, to my mind, was still not convinced. He was not convinced because he knew the costs and knew the difficulties of sending that many troops and what was going to be required internationally, diplomatically, and militarily to remove Saddam and to make sure that this would not actually stand. So how do we get, therefore, from the moment when President Bush understands the importance of this argument to when he's actually finally willing to stand up and say, we must do something about it? And I would contend that this is actually a great moment where General Scowcroft could step in as a national security advisor and give clear-headed advice, but also ensure the president understood the clear parameters of the decision he was about to make. And the situation, in fact, the actual physical space of that conversation was crucial, I argue. President Bush had to leave the White House after that second meeting and go out to Aspen, where, of course, he famously met with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in a prearranged meeting. Aspen cannot accommodate the 747 that is Air Force One. Consequently, the president and his small staff at that point, a skeleton staff at that point, loaded up on a very, very small plane, so much so that it was only capable of holding 4 people seated across from each other next to the president. So therefore, we have President Bush, Roman Papaduke, who used to head the foundation here and was, at that point was one of the State Department's public liaison, if I remember correctly, or something. He had a more fancy title than that, but that was basically it. And then General Scowcroft. And as Scowcroft described it, they were sitting so close to each other, their knees actually touched. And they had papers spread out and folders spread out so that you couldn't actually tell whose lap which folder was on. And that moment, Scowcroft decided that he was going to, shall we say, convince the president. Now, one of the things that has not been discussed to date in all the laudatory discussion of General Scowcroft this morning is his physical stature. There isn't much. He is, shall we say, a diminutive human being. President Bush is not. He's a strapping 6'3", I think, kind of guy. But this is a moment where General Scowcroft was able to, with their knees touching in this small enclosed space of a small plane being used as Air Force One, lean forward in his conversation and point his finger at the papers, and then subsequently point his finger in the president's chest. Why? Because they could reach out and touch each other across this small space. Now, I'm not here to tell you that this is exactly why President Bush made his decision. I think he was leaning that way. And certainly the story I'm not telling you is that the President of the United States was physically intimidated and browbeated by one of his associates into going to war. That's not the story I'm going to tell you. But the story I am here to tell you is that the National Security Advisor at that point, in a moment of seclusion, was able to explain to the President with great conviction, here is what matters. And we've already heard several advisors to presidents this morning say that what really matters in convincing a president is how convincing you can be. Because everyone has a good story to tell and everybody has good information to use, but if you really believe something is crucial, you will put your reputation on the line. And this is a moment where, with no one else around, General Scowcroft was able to say, Mr. President, this is a decision not only that only you can make, but that you must make in the most forceful way possible, thereby changing, I would argue, not necessarily the course of history, but at least its pace, which I think is ultimately the importance of the National Security Advisor, as General Scowcroft described to us. I will open it up to interrogation at that point.
Well, the subject of the panel is operating style, and I wonder if we could get you did a good description of how he viewed the job of National Security Advisor, depending on the foreign policy experience of a president, of keeping them within bounds. So there's probably a set of conventional wisdoms out there in the national security establishment, and we need to pay respect to them and not have radical change. It's actually a very traditionally conservative notion and reminds me of why people thought of Scowcroft as not an academic realist, but sort of a traditional conservative realist. Can you contrast Scowcroft's operating style with maybe some other national security advisors you have studied to sort of, in that contrast, give us a sense about how Scowcroft was different? And in particular, if you could say something about Reagan's national security advisor when he was at Reykjavik, who let him get off the rails, right? Because Scowcroft wouldn't let that happen, but Reagan's advisor did.
It's very difficult to say something publicly about the Reagan national security apparatus. It's safe to say that the reason that we understand General Scowcroft's leadership as National Security Advisor and hold it up as the gold standard, as the example for how a system should work, you must recall it was created from a negative example. Which is that the Reagan system had broken down repeatedly and successively, leading, I think one can safely say, to the difficulties that became known as Iran-Contra, right, but also leading to the difficulty, as Scowcroft saw, of something even more important, which was the difficulty of the president removing some of the crucial foundational planks of American foreign policy. Mm-hmm. Remember, the Bush administration, I mean, of course, Bush 41, was not nearly as enthusiastic about the potential for an ending Cold War as was the outgoing Reagan administration, for a variety of reasons, not least of which I think is because Reagan wanted it to happen. Right. The Bush administration's response really was summed up by something that President Bush said wonderfully while on the campaign trail, which was, first, the jury's still out on this guy, Gorbachev. But secondly, and more fundamentally, we're not sure it's necessarily a good thing if the Soviet Union collapses in the first place. Why? Because there's never been a case in human history where you have a global empire collapse without an ensuing great power war. And the Soviet Union is not your typical empire. It's made up of at least 16 different languages and 65 different ethnic groups, or a lot. And by the way, here's the kicker, 20,000 nuclear weapons. Yeah. So what happens when you have a centrifugal force attack an empire that already has tensions and has nuclear weapons? And consequently, it's a very interesting question, I think, to compare Reagan and Bush and their ensuing advisors as strategists. Mm-hmm. Because we are asked often to define what is a strategist and what is strategy. You can usually get your answer based upon how you want to frame the question. But one way to look at it is, does a leader get what they want? Mm-hmm. Reagan gets what he wants. He gets the Soviet Union ultimately to collapse, though I would argue that has much more to do with the Soviets than it does with anything the Americans do. But what Bush was more concerned about was, well, what happens after you get what you want? After we get this victory, then what? And I think that's where we see the influence of someone like Scowcroft as a conservative realist really come into play. because at a moment of great international flux, as we've, again, already heard this morning, this is a moment where the administration is being hit repeatedly with tectonic waves and tectonic shakes to everything that they believe to be crucial about the world, not least of which is the entire professional experience of their lives had been disrupted with the end of the Cold War. What do you do when you have everything disrupted? You go back to the things that really matter. And what really mattered for them was the primacy of American power, the primacy of American influence around the world, and in particular, and this is really the most important thing I found from studying this administration, the primacy of having an American presence overseas in Europe. Why? Because what is the history of the 20th century from their perspective? Well, if you're European, the history of the 20th century is that the Germans will attack you from time to time. This, of course, leads to a lot of the miscomfort, if you will, with German unification, but also helps to explain why George Bush and Brent Scowcroft and James Baker were much more in favor of unification than any of their other European allies, because their history of the European history was different. Their history of Europe suggested that it's not that the Germans go to war every 20 years, it's that you all go to war every 20 years. And the only time you haven't gone to war is when we stayed. And we went over and solved your problems in World War I, and then we left, and look what happened. So therefore, the most important foundational point in a moment of great international flux is to ensure that the American presence continues. How do we ensure the American presence continues? It's to ensure our invitation to stay on the continent continues, which means ensure NATO continues. So the reason I mention this is if you look at this great series of cacophonous events, if you will, the entire snow globe of the world is being shaken up, and we're not sure where all the pieces are going to ultimately land. Scowcroft's great insight, which he was in agreement with the president and others, but I think this is really Scowcroft's great insight, is when you're in a period of flux, go back to what creates the most stability and what you care about most. Yeah. And in that case, for them, it was American influence. So in answer to the question of what was it that separated them from, let's say, the Reagan group, I think it's this ability to find what was really crucial. Yeah. Now, to answer one other aspect real briefly, which is unlikely, I know you think, one way in which the president and Scowcroft and others were very good about debating issues that I think is different from other administrations is that General Scowcroft would arrange what they referred to as scheduled train wrecks in the West Wing, which essentially were for the president to see people with different opinions argue in front of him and argue their position vehemently in front of them. Now, keep in mind, this is not necessarily an interactive experience. This is not necessarily for the president in order to interrogate people and ask, why do you think that, and to drill down into a person's thinking in order to get their conviction. The purpose of this exercise was so the president could essentially gauge the evidence that you were using to pull your argument together. So if one person came in saying, I believe we should do X, and has flimsy evidence, the person who is arguing against them will very quickly point out their flimsy evidence in front of the president. So in terms of the National Security Advisor's role in demonstrating to the president the variety of options out there, but also showing the president that he has the opportunity to see different opinions and have them laid out with equal fervor in front of him, that I think is one of the ways that the Scowcroft group and the Scowcroft administration did that.
So the key characteristics of the operating style are, one, arrange for the president to see the clash of ideas, and two, have a coherent strategy or grand strategy or view of how the world works, right? And in the Reagan administration, you see wild gyrations. They come in, if you go read Bob Scheer's book about Reagan's views on nuclear war, you would think the guy loved nuclear war, and then by the time he got to 1986, he I guess the day after had an effect on him, but yes, he changed his mind. So the first Bush administration had a coherent worldview, and they understood you needed to think about what came after next. So then my question is, why didn't they see what came after next, or what came after victory in the Gulf War? Because after Saddam is ejected from Kuwait, we're kind of left in this strategic period where people began to criticize the grown-ups, the strategy.